Bienvenue dans
Welcome everyone to this new episode of this series of podcasts. This is a rather special episode where we will try to address and understand the competency reform. I am joined by Mr. Majeda. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. This reform has been getting a lot of attention. We'll try to understand where it comes from, how it was developed, and how it works. Then we'll try to look at the feedback I've received, my perspective, as well as the students' viewpoint regarding this reform. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, so I'm Manuel Majeda. I'm a contract professor researcher, and I'm head of the educational system within the UTC, and I'm in charge of implementing the new competency approach.
Were you actually behind the competency reform, or were you asked to implement it?
I was asked to implement it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was asked to implement it. Naturally, these are things that I'm dealing with anyway, because they are closely related to the pedagogy and to the evolution of teaching practices. The real deal here is to manage a request coming from two different institutions. The first one is the CTI, which is the Engineering Degree Commission, that authorizes us to award our degree. They had asked us during the previous term, about 7 years ago, to implement the competency approach and to initiate it. However, the most prominent requester was or is the Ministry of Higher Education and Research, also called the HERS, which is basically the ministry in charge of the higher education, like masters.
Okay. So obviously this reform have certain advantages and disadvantages. Nevertheless, we need to keep in mind that it wasn't the UTC initiative.
Yes, it's correct, because the UTC had already a system that promotes the acquisition of skills. Historically, we were one of the first schools to implement this much internships and industry projects. We know that it's in the workplace where you acquire many of the engineering competencies through practical implementation, creating actual products while dealing with the real-world situation. So internships are important. We also had a second system, which was that we gave, and we still give, a significant role to students' association within the UTC. It encourages the acquirement of what we call transferable skills, whether they are facilitation skills, coordination skills, budgeting skills,
Various management skills.
yes, including different types of management too. In short, a number of skills that you implement along with the corresponding responsibilities, because having skills is good, but it's necessary to experience the responsibilities too. So that's the second key aspect of the UTC that we've implemented for a long time. Then the third key point, which is really crucial concerning the UTC reform, is that engineering students don't always realize, because you have that a la carte choices, but in reality, the students end up paying the freedom of choice. You pay it because you're forced to make this choice, and therefore you're forced to make compromises. For example, you might have to add additional effort if you choose a new course for which you have no prerequisites, because nothing prevents you from taking it, but you'll struggle a bit at the beginning to prepare and catch up. But since it's your choice, you'll make that effort and you'll face the consequences of your choice. If they're negative, well, you'll have to deal with it. And if you fail, it's not a real failure, because at the UTC, we won't ask you to retake it. We'll say, look, you already learned things, you made a choice, it served a purpose, you have some elements already, so it's less serious. And you'll see, it still requires additional effort from a cognitive and intellectual perspective. And then there are other choices, like having to work with others from different specialties, cultures. Yeah, you'll learn things quite quickly, but ultimately it will require you to make compromises, to know how to manage a group, how to balance workload, and so on. All these elements of work with other people from different cultures, different branches, etc., different levels, will develop your meta competencies. We must say that as a result, the path isn't always super simple. You'll make your own choices and adapt to them depending on the situations. You will also have to adapt to choices that aren't yours. This will help you mature even more, so you already benefit from the advantage of a path where meta competencies are distinctive elements of employability to young UTC graduates. And companies tell us this.
And I think we already had the chance to discuss it together, that these meta competencies, we did get feedback indicating that engineers graduating from the UTC had acquired them. It's not just assumed. We had actually gathered this information through surveys and stats.
Yes, and we still get this feedback about our young UTC engineer being different. Different in the sense that first, they had a more societal vision. They are more socially aware, but also they have a more pragmatic vision. They are described as resourceful, flexible, easy to adapt. They know how to take charge because they're in an organization, a system that's a bit different and slightly different where everything doesn't necessarily happen as it should. They know how to adapt, and that's precisely this à la carte training that forces development of those meta competences that stands out globally on the subject. Then, of course, there's variability among students. I mean, some are more or less strong in these areas, but there's still basic foundation, which means that the employer feedback was positive and consequently, there was a survey on the prospection of students, companies. It was done for the UTC, I think, around the 40th anniversary, and then a second one for the 50th anniversary, and it came out strongly again. It also came out strongly in a rather implicit and explicit way, too. Meaning these are skills that you possess and that are differentiating you compared to others.
Okay, so following this, basically it's part of the desire of the CTI and the Ministry of Higher Education to standardize and to create a more common profile for students from different schools.
Yeah, actually, there are several interconnected factors. We are in a societal context where nowadays more than 80% of the students in each age group pass their baccalaureate, which means that the majority goes on to higher education. What you need to understand is that this isn't just a UTC issue that we have. We're part of a bigger picture, which means that the Ministry of the CTI wants to promote job placements, wants to promote professional integration. We don't have an issue with the professional integration, so initially we don't ask ourselves this kind of question. We know we train you well because since you get jobs and the salary that are good, everything must be going well. So we know we're meeting a need and that we're providing high quality job placements. However, looking at the bigger picture, we know that a large portion of students who went to university don't necessarily find jobs quickly, or at least not work that is appropriated to their level of expertise. For example, you're automatically hired as what we call in French a cadre, which will say it's a manager position. Now, most master graduates aren't managers. That's just the reality. You must know some friends who's done 5 years of study and ended up in a position that aren't management roles. With lower salaries, some don't, but some do, and that's the idea. The ministry perspective on this is to promote job placement and employability. And for that, the skills-based approach seems to be the one that is the most effective. It's not wrong to think that way because focusing on skills means focusing on employability. So it's within this context that we are caught up. And so we're being asked to implement a skills-based approach even though we already have skills which are already acquired and verified by employers. It's quite paradoxical because they're asking us to implement a process to obtain skills when we already kind of have those skills.
So now that we have to implement this reform, which has been in place for, it's been in place for 2 years, but was actually finalized and completed about a year ago.
It was done in like June 2022.
And now the question is what form does it take for students? We've already had the chance to communicate a bit on different UTC networks, but if we do a recap, what form does it take and what changes does it bring?
What you need to understand is that before talking about the students' impact, the first thing we need to do was to think about how to implement the competency-based approach. And especially, what is the benefit for us, for teachers, for the school, and for the students? As I said, most students already acquired meta-competencies, so why implement a competency approach then? Well, first reason, unfortunately, is that we have to, or we won't get accreditation, so that kind of settles the issue. The second reason is that we actually found meaning in the competency approach, because it turns out that this famous competency approach, which in itself, I repeat, is a rather good idea overall. However, it poses a problem because it's associated with a program approach concept against our concept at the UTC. This approach, to draw a parallel with like a school close to us, I would say it's the same as the INSA Lyon, meaning you enroll and you have a course unit, you must absolutely do those units, you have no choice and you have to pass them. And when you fail the course unit, it prevents you from taking other units. It can also prevent you from continuing the program. The INSA Lyon model is not a bad model in the absolute term. It's just a different model from ours that allows for complete knowledge acquisition, but it removes that meta-competency aspect, which is gained through internships, etc. At the end, their graduates are simply perceived differently from ours. differently, but both schools are very excellent. They just have different approaches. And for us, losing this model of individualized training for program approach, which in general, it's a traditional university or school, it wouldn't be a bad model. But for us, it would take away things. Among these things taken away, there are some extremely important elements. The first thing is that it will cause us to lose students. Because when you come to the UTC, you come for the flexible approach, for the a la carte offer.
Yeah.
Especially for a student going through like a period of uncertainty, meaning like a period where things are a bit unclear. You know that when you're in your 2 years of TC, you don't know yet what you want to do. And so you have this additional freedom, even if you haven't necessarily done well in the initial course unit, initiating to a specialty, for example, you can still go to that specialty.
Yeah, and if I may add something, this system we had at the UTC works very well for both students who were unsure, a bit unclear, and wanted to experiment for like 2 years, as well as for students who had a pretty clear idea on what they wanted to do and who, from the start, could take the course units that allowed them to.
Even going as far as the free track, like the Filière Libre, which makes us actually the only school that offers the ability to create your own degree. So that's the first point. If you remove this, will students with good grades who could go to prep school or go to other schools still come? That's a real concern. And the second element, even more troubling, is that if we switch to a program approach, what will differentiate us from other schools? What will create the UTC edge that makes the employer choose the UTC graduates because they know that when they have a UTC graduate, they're not going to be stuck in their ways. They'll have the ability to respond quickly, to adapt, and so on. They'll have these specific qualities that makes employers want to hire them over others. And this is often a comment made by employers that they know they won't have these types of problems when they get a UTC. They are talking about the ability to adapt and organize, etc. Whereas with other students, they'll say that they'll need more guidance. So really, if we lose this, if we implement this program approach, we lose our uniqueness, both in attracting students through offering a unique pathway, but also in terms of employers in offering that special UTC advantage.
So the competency reform seeks to be a compromise between the UTC system we had and the program reform expected by the CTI?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, we thought that the best compromise that would allow us to both meet the CTI requirements while having meaning, like not just pretending, but having a real meaning in the competency approach, while preserving the UTC model so that it can continue to be as effective through the new reform, the new approach.
All right, so if we get into more detail, so there are what we could say frameworks that have been created, the disciplinary framework and the transversal framework. So the disciplinary framework can be obtained through courses units, whereas the transversal framework is a bit more unclear. Is it up to the advisor, the student advisor to validate? That's what we've heard, but I understand recently that wasn't necessarily the case.
So for that, we need to go back to what I was saying about how we only have the UTC competency approach, which is an approach that seeks to preserve our model and meet the needs. So the classic model is to pass competency through courses unit, because that's the classical approach, right? So we put the burden of skill acquisition on the teacher because the idea is that the teacher is in charge of their teaching practice and to change it if it's necessary. And it turns out that at the UTC, a large part of the teaching practices are project-based units that include practical work, include practical lab, etc. So actually, we're already using quite a few active methods. Yes, a bit less in the CS and more in the TM, but with a balance rather favorable to active method and particularly in recent years. We took this model, and for the students, actually, well, it's very simple. If they pass their UV, they have acquired the skills associated with it. So there you have it. It's a model, I would say it's very transparent through the UV. It's rather on the teacher that falls all the weight of proving that they are teaching the particular skill that they say they're teaching. So we're going to put additional weight on them by having to do additional work. As for the students, it's completely transparent. And they have their UV and they have their skills. However, how to prove students' meta skills? So we have two ways. The first ways was to do a survey, which we do with employers. It's good, it's nice, but it's not individual, which means that it doesn't really make sense. Therefore, we took the portfolio method. The portfolio is simply the idea that the students will, throughout their journey, note down the skills they have acquired in a document called the portfolio, and they'll trace off their own skills acquisition.
If we want to specify, in this document, we find skills related to school association, project skills, and skills such as the meta skills acquired during internship, for example.
Yes, we took what we call transversal skills, which are those coming from an Anglo-Saxon movement of engineering school that implemented what we call CDIO, which is an integrated design approach that incorporates both societal parameters and what we call best practice. There is also intelligence of systemic vision. Basically, it's the UTC's value with a bit less of a humanistic vision than what we have at the UTC, because we're very strong on the subject. But anyway, what we need to remember is that those notions of meta skills in reality are what we call polysemic, which means that they have multiple meaning. It comes down to 4 or 5 main categories, but it takes very diverse form. For example, you can have entrepreneurship, but is an entrepreneurship and associative investment at time very close in reality? You have systemic vision, which can be both in modeling, but also in ability to manage a large project. So it's often very vague. So this notion of meta skills, there's a framework, but it's more of an indicative framework than a real one.
Okay, we'll come back to students' opinion a bit later, but many questioned us about how do we validate these skills? How can they pass their transversal framework?
So the word validation is a bit complicated for us. It's a bit incorrect, actually, because in reality, when we had acquired these skills at the UTC previously, you never validated them. They were acquired, period. They were demonstrated in internship or in professional life, and it was rather your employer who would express it. But in reality, well, you didn't have to directly be approved. So what needs to be understood is that now the UTC needs to approve your portfolio. The principle is that it is more about making the effort to show someone a structured document that proves the traceability of your skills and the level associated with it. For example, someone will give you feedback on your competency so that you can position yourself. We are not in a strict academic environment. You're really in a logic that the portfolio is a tool for you to structure your skills, to be able to position yourself, but also to prepare yourself to show it to the future employer, internship supervisor, and others, just to get feedback from them. Initially, we did plan to go through your advisor, your conseiller, yes. But we realized that it was difficult for several internal reasons regarding advisor workload, but also the student's relationship concerning the advisor's role, which is a bit complicated, right? Because, it can be different from everyone. We thought of other validation method that we're currently implementing, which is very simple. Throughout your journey, you'll note your skills in a portfolio, and then, at some point, you'll present it to a judge. This judge, well, it's relatively simple. It will be your supervisor or your intern mentor in the company because, well, the idea is to say since these skills are meant to be particularly appreciated in business, well, might as well get business feedback on these skills, okay? So, does the person think that you're right there, that you got it? Do they think that, on the contrary, certain skills isn't sufficiently developed according to them, in their context? It might have been in another context, and not sufficiently according to them in theirs. So the idea is that it's validated by the company in the sense of, yes, it's coherent. The reality is to validate the coherence of the whole thing, the whole journey, because it's quite hard to just validate one transversal skill.
Okay, because then, if I understood correctly, many students may have perceived the transversal framework as putting some pressure on them to validate a certain number of skills in order to graduate. Which, if I understand what you're telling me, the actual idea is rather to provide a tool to students so that they actively track the skills and meta skills that they have validated during their program and allow them to organize it to themselves.
Yes, exactly. One nuance, though, is that students are now forced to work on these meta skills. Before, you were kind of left with like a certain choice. Eventually, you were somewhat forced to acquire them. Now the idea is that there's a minimum of meta skills, a specific number is given, and if you've reached it, well, that's good. If you haven't reached it, well, it's a bit of a problem. The goal is to give a minimum to reach for the students to know what is expected of them. Because actually the problem for students, and I understand this, because they don't really see the point of feeling the meta skills because in reality, until they've reached their internship, these meta skills, they experience them well. They don't have any academic pressure on this subject. So, in reality, they don't necessarily feel like feeling it. And feeling it just to feel it obviously makes no sense. We should also make the effort to communicate to the students, saying, be careful, this is also a tool to prepare yourself for the internship, even if you're not there yet. Prepare yourself for a personal pitch, to sell yourself to get not just the usual internship, but an internship with something extra, more interesting for you, whether you have it or not. It's always a bit complicated after meeting with the company. But that's really the principle, giving meaning to the portfolio. Knowing that the portfolio alone, well, yes, noting your skill in abstract doesn't make much sense, unless you think that it's something that you'll be able to negotiate, show value. There are students who already know this and are very aware of this. It's because they already have a project that they strongly believe in, but it's not the majority of the UTC.
Okay, I understand after having addressed perhaps this reform in detail, well, more in detail, but about the reform itself. I would also like to discuss with you if you'd like to address the point of view of students facing this reform. And actually know what responses we can give them, of course. I've already had the chance to do some communication about the skills. I've had some feedback and I've had several exchanges with different students. A first concern is that they feel like we threw the reform at them, just like that. But I suppose that's a matter of time because the reform has just been implemented.
Two reasons. First, there's a question of timing, which students often don't realize. Implementing the competency-based approach is actually closely linked to the work on redesigning the training program of departments. The department have completely redone their training program. We can discuss this more later, but let's just say that there was a desire from the department to completely redo the training program to create what we call a general engineer. And this reform had two objectives. It had a first objective, which was a request of the CTI, who wanted us to focus more on creating a general engineering program and emphasize greatly the concept of a general engineer. The CTI is always worried about gaps existing in our training program, so they were saying, no, it's not possible, they must do this, and that. And we said, well, it's optional, and they might not do everything, every single this and that you want.
That's the confrontation between CTI's demand and UTC's offering, and the system we stand by. And
there's also from the teachers a concern about seeing fewer and fewer students naturally gravitating towards the basic foundation of a general engineering, which was previously not the case, meaning that students had this feeling of going a bit further on general engineering basic, looking for the foundation, and then they could move around. They noticed this was becoming less and less common, and so they also insisted that it should become more formal, more structured, therefore a bit more restrictive. That's the first point. We underwent this reform in a good way, but people had to implement it. There were discussions, it took time, we negotiated, had debate, examined many possibilities, and by the way, some students were involved, especially elected representatives. So the second element, well, it's simply that we're in an approach that CTI asks to implement what the ministry asks. But there's no good or bad way to do this because it's so new. These are very theoretical things. In the first year, we're in what we call the learning by doing approach, meaning we build tools and validate them at the same time. There are examples of such an implementation in Canada, Belgium, etc. But in reality, no one had ever implemented it on a large scale. Just a small test here and there, small experiments, of course. But when it's implemented in other countries, like Quebec, for example, it's not like us at all. Quebec people pay for their training, so, if you will, they enter into a pure competency logic. The employers, the corporation, for example, the corporation of engineers, defines the model. So we're in a different network, and we had to build our own approach. So when you combine implementing a new training program, plus behind it a learning by doing approach, well, it means that in terms of information for students, everything isn't sufficiently and very precise, but we're trying to improve.
And that means we are currently still in a testing phase of the reform?
Well, we're not in a tasting phase, we're in a co-construction phase. We try to involve elected students, representatives, in all our steps. We've done it from the start, it seems very important to us. Simply, each time there is small changes in the reform. For example, with the CTI, there are new elements that have appeared. It turns out we anticipated them. them. So we're pretty good on that. But there's additional formalism that needs to be done. So we need to keep that in mind. To implement the reform through the student's advisor, we thought of that at first, but it wasn't a good choice. So we realized that it wasn't working and we had to change it. So now we're in an adjustment phase of implementation in which we know there will be 2 or 3 cohorts impacted by these states. So if someone doesn't have all their skills validated, and we see it's not because they didn't want to, but simply because...
There will be tolerance for those type of things?
Yeah, exactly. The board will look at that, and that's stated from the start.
So if we talk about this learning by doing, I think we can connect that also to the feeling that in some departments, the reform is going very well, and frameworks are quite well adapted to what's already being done there. I'm thinking particularly of process engineering, which concerns me, but even biological engineering. I've had several positive feedbacks. I'm not speaking for all students, but some have said that they validated quickly their disciplinary framework without even worrying. In GP, that's also the case. Other branches that are struggling a bit more, notably computer engineering or mechanical engineering, in that case, it's maybe a question of the scope of knowledge in each field.
I mean, yes, we still have different sizes within those departments. In those different branches, we also have professional variation that are really quite different, and then also professional cultures that are different. For example, in mechanism, you have multiple different professional cultures. In GP, it's a bit more concentrated, even more in DB. You have only there 2 or 3 professional cultures, and it's strong identity though, but there's less of them. Of course, there are many variations, but inevitably, there are departments where coherence seems easier. But in my opinion, this is also due to specific points that students might not necessarily have understood, which is that this reform, which is independent of skills, as we've already said, skills are just a tool, and we could have taken the old framework. We could have also done the same skill approach. It's also the teacher's desire to achieve a common profile that's more generalist, which therefore means more restrictions. Because if you want a generalist engineer, students need to take some additional courses compared to what they might have naturally chosen. So to get this generalist engineer concept, this engineering label, if you will, it's a way of giving them a more employable profile. This will naturally bring additional restriction. Those restrictions can be of 2 types. They can be either temporal. The temporal aspect of it is, for example, having to make choices earlier. Because if you need to become a generalist engineer and if you want to go into other specialties, you'll need to plan ahead of time and prepare well. This is not something we're used to in the UTC mindsets. The students, well, they used to have a bit more time, but now they have less, it's true. They need to plan ahead. So this is more of a time restriction, and that's not really the usual for the UTC. And then the second restriction is that, yes, well, they'll have to take courses they don't really want to because it's part of the generalist engineering program. So yes, those courses, they could, with a bit of a student's cleverness, have been avoided. Well, now students won't be able to bypass this, and it will apply to maybe 1 or 2 courses.
So the idea is to say that even if it's a student feedback we've heard a lot, saying that I didn't want to do this course, it doesn't interest me much because of the reform, I have to take this class. The answer is that you will need to address these skills, because it's part of having a diploma in IM, GI or GP.
Well, it's not even a matter of skills, as I repeat, it's a matter of generalist engineering profile. The idea is to say, if you want to be employable, so to find a job easily, whether it is right after the UTC or in a further future, and that's something the UTC don't want to leave to chances, you will need to have good foundations. It's all about what compromise we make between foundations and freedom, and it's a compromise that's always very difficult to make. Individually, the departments have felt it was hard to make this compromise. And, they felt like at the UTC, there should be a need for an offer for a more generalist PCB, and it's a compromise. They want to keep this flexibility, but still put into work this generalist profile. So the idea is to say, yes, there will be a compromise to make between freedom and a more enhanced, employable future. We can agree or disagree on that. It's really a matter of perception, I guess.
Of course, we could certainly debate this for hours, but I'd like to go back to something. We asked students for their opinions on the UTC group, and we got several responses, particularly one that caught my attention, and I'd like to read it because I think it really represents this student perspective. She says, I feel like it's not as simple as they make it sound to validate all these skills in just 3 semesters at UTC, especially if you take in consideration internships and Erasmus programs, without really restricting our course choices. Students are worried about not being able to validate all their competencies while choosing their specialization and subjects that interest them. We are also feeling the pressure of being the first ones to test this new system. We have some pressure being the first one to test this new approach, and it's not very reassuring. Plus, not all professors seem to be aware of these competencies, so they are not always in the best position to help us make our own choices. In theory, it's a good idea, and we understand the goal of having a legitimate degree. We are targeting essential skills for our training within each department. But in practice, we don't want to be forced to choose a course that validates a competency rather than one that interests us more.
This is an interesting response because it shows the student's level of understanding. I'm always very impressed by feedbacks that shows such maturity about the subject. Let's look at the key point that came up. The first element we mentioned is a communication issue. There's communication being done by the department about everything related to the PCB reform, and it was done very thoughtfully through working groups and so on. But everyone was able to only do it in their own area of expertise. Simply put, each person worked within their competency zone, what we call competency blocks or competency communities. So some instructor might not have the full picture. That's possible, but the information is available through all the educational coordinators, who can certainly pass it along. So that's the first point. Yes, some teacher might not have the full picture precisely because they worked in their sphere of expertise, and it's not necessarily with the global vision of the entire structure. The second element is that
this notion of choosing between competencies and specialization tracks.
Yes, unfortunately, since we're enhancing this general engineering track, we have removed some degree of freedom regarding specialization. Now, I should clarify about total freedom. It's debatable because by planning well ahead for specialization, you can make it work. But as we've said, it means it's much more restricted. Essentially, we're looking at someone who will need to develop quickly their vision of what they want to do. If you can't develop your vision immediately, there will be choices that you will be limited over time. But the later you decide, the fewer options you'll have, that's for sure. Whereas before, you had more choices even if you started later. So that's really the key concept here. So yes, there is indeed a loss in favor of the general engineering profile. I repeat, we've done testing and everything, but yes, you need to plan earlier if you want to really use the full range of options. However, before the reform was there are actually very few students who are actually really using the full range of options and courses they could take. So we also made our choices based on statistics on what students used to do.
Okay, so I think the episode is coming to an end. But regarding the concerns, particularly from IM and GI departments, is it up to the students to evolve, to change their perspective, to adapt the competency reform? Or will the framework also be adjusted to better match this balance between freedom of choice and common profile? Or is it a bit of both?
I think it's definitely a bit of both. As I said, it's an ongoing process. We've done simulation, etc. I don't think if you realize it, but I must say the educational coordinators have done enormous work simulating how many students could achieve the common branch profile, do PSF, etc. So there's been a whole simulation process, and basically it worked 80 to 90% of the time it worked. So that's what we're working on. Now, typically, we're seeing some side effects where students optimize by saying, well, to get this competency, there's this course that's less demanding, so I'll take it because it's a way for me to avoid these other demanding courses for that same competency. So we're seeing transfers of course optimization that's causing imbalance in courses. Some courses that maybe require less work or are less time-consuming on certain aspects are being favored over others to obtain the competency and to get it out of the way. So it's not really what we had planned. We expected a bit more maturity from our students on this subject, but it's really what we have to restructure accordingly. So we've also realized that maybe we've planned this a bit too heavy or maybe too light. So naturally, there will be an ongoing adjustments to the actual framework to take it into account. The second point is that, for me, this is an essential element, and I hope that it will help students understand that this choice is a decision made for the students, not for the teachers. It doesn't change anything for us, actually, as teachers. I mean, we still teach the same course, etc. It's a choice made for the students. Now, some might disagree. There are criticism and it's up for debate, but this needs to be done at the department level with elected representatives in the Improvement Council and so on to advocate. These are reasoned choices, meaning that for us, our responsibility is to give you employability in the short, medium, and long term, because we're going to change 3, 4, 5 companies in our life, and it will be even if in different careers. So we try to find this compromise, and that's the goal of the reform, that's the result we want. It's really about this compromise that we can agree on or disagree on. Of course, it's still subjective, and it's okay for students to disagree with us. Obviously, it's difficult. What's difficult is for students who started their journey at the UTC in the old system. They are moving into a more restrictive mode. So, of course, it's harder for them to accept. The new students will start directly in this mode, and it will go much more smoothly for them, that's for sure. So we're trying to take this into consideration and to stay flexible as much as we can.
That's also why there's flexibility regarding the first 3 generations. That's what you were saying about the examination board?
Yes, and I think students know that, but the board's goal is not to kick you off the school. The goal is to help you, and if someone is dysfunctional, the idea is that the board takes these realities into account, and what matters is simply that the students should be consistent in their choices. So if you make choices that are purely about optimization, at some point the board might not be very happy about that, but we can also understand that you might have trouble along the way.
So, if they made a justified choice in relation to what they really want to do, they have already an idea in which field they want to work in. And they can justify that they've acquired some fundamental skills.
Yeah, and even if they haven't succeeded in others, that's okay, because we're still at the UTC, so there are some circumstances, and we still have some flexibility. You really have to take into consideration that there is more restriction, and it's a necessity to have maturity because it doesn't come from the faculty as such, but from the notion of future employability of students. And it's particularly difficult because if you don't have this vision, when you graduate, yes, you're employable right away, but the question is whether or not in 3 to 5 years this will still be the case. It won't still be the case if you're missing this or that aspect. So if you've only barely touched on one of the subject or one of this foundation, there will be a responsibility of this institution. The institution has to make the effort for you. Even if it constrains you, even if there's restriction that needs to be applied on students, it would be better for you to have this restriction so that it gives you a better employability at the end of the day.
Okay, so maybe a final word to address to the students, to maybe reassure some who would worry still about skills or something. We can add something about the evolution of skills, maybe.
So when you pass your UV, you achieve the disciplinary skills, and the reinforcement of PCB will focus on UV that aren't necessarily the one you want to choose. All we do is try to preserve the choices as much as possible. So we have restriction, we have limits, yes, but we have preserved choices as much as we could, and it's a really strong desire. Because it's additional work, but we think that the people who are here at the UTC are committed to this. It's very clear from the alumni. I see them working. I tell myself, wow, we go for it. So that's what I tell students. It's a compromise we made to preserve the freedom, which isn't just a response to the CTI, because that doesn't make any sense. Without the CTI, it's problematic, and it's mainly a compromise for future, for stronger employability of our students. But it's especially a compromise for the future, for your future employability. You have to hear it. You have to accept it, because every institution mandates it. So that's for the disciplinary UV. So it's relatively simple, yes. You maybe have there will be people who don't like it, but that's okay. It's the price to pay to preserve freedom. The second key element about transversal skills, we're doing it simply because we're asking you to formalize your skill to better self yourself again. Not to develop your employability, but you would have done that already since you've had it already to better self yourself and bounce back more easily later. Because you'll see that in every performance review, these elements come out very strongly.
Very well. I think we've covered pretty much all of the skill system from causes to consequences. Thank you very much for responding to our invitation. Thank you also to those who watched this episode. Thanks to Cecile, who's behind the camera, and thanks to all those who were able to participate in creating this episode. Thank you very, very much for responding, and don't hesitate to follow us on our networks. Thanks, everyone, and thank you, sir.